The Rhode Island School of Design has become a thought leader in the area of STEAM, an initiative to add art and design to the national educational agenda, advocating for more emphasis on STEM subjects. RISD did not come up with the idea of STEAM. That can be given to Georgette Yackman, I think it was University of Virginia, and for a while, she was actually in South Korea, because believe it or not, the South Koreans were the only ones who would listen to her for a little while. But she is thankfully back in the United States, and there are new STEAM academies opening up geometrically across the country. But thanks in part to the efforts of RISD President John Maida and his esteemed faculty, which Cas is a part of, STEAM has picked up some much needed momentum in the past 2 years. With the emergence of these STEAM-based academies that we were talking about, there is in federal legislation, the Obama administration promises about, I think it's around $800 million per year for STEM initiatives, and there is an initiative underway to try and draw some of that away for STEAM-based initiatives as well, to include art and design in that process. I contacted Mr. Maida's office to see if RISD wanted to send a representative down to talk about some of what they're doing, and Cas stepped up to the plate and volunteered. She is an assistant professor of industrial design, and she describes herself as a designer of playthings. These are some of the playthings. These playthings include the workyard kit, a set of oversized wooden planks and connectors designed for Friends of the High Line, and currently used on Manhattan's High Line Park. I took some of I'm an adjunct professor at Kane University as well, at the Robert Bush School of Design, and I took a group of students to the High Line on a very rainy day. And if you have not been to the High Line Park in New York City, then you really need to visit it. It is absolutely phenomenal. She is currently working with play advocacy group Kaboom to bring the workyard kit to public and private schools all across the United States. So bringing you her vision of imaginative, free play, creativity, and STEAM, Cas Holman.
Hello. Thank you, Joan. So in thinking about this kind of collection of topics and how these things interrelate, and I seem to always be reflecting on how my teaching and my practice and early education and art and creativity, where do all these things intersect? And I think more often I try to find out where they don't intersect. And mostly that happens when I'm trying to clarify it for clarification. So forgive me if they weave in and out of each other. That may or may not be intentional. I'll let you decide. Which will be whether or not it makes sense. So designing for creativity, play, and the STEAM disciplines, I feel like is almost really saying that we're designing designers. Particularly in the early education materials that I design, and in the way that many of us as educators, either in K-12 or at the university level, are designing our syllabus and thinking about how we teach design or how we teach fine art. But in designing designers, I was thinking, well, but what is that? What is it to design a designer? And being someone who's kind of an advocate of, well, not kind of, I'm an advocate of constructivist theory and constructivist learning. I see designing designers as really enabling creativity. So enabling meaning supporting creativity. So what is it to enable a designer? And for me, that is supporting a student or a person or a child in a certain approach to both thinking, curiosity, exploring, and a willingness to try, which you may also say is a willingness to failure, or willingness to fail, which I think in design, and particularly in industrial design, and as we saw through our process of sketching, there's a certain tinkering and a certain, we're not completely attached to any one outcome. So it's a very exploratory process, which I think relates quite a bit to the constructivist theories in education. So this has been a beautiful pairing for me at RISD, because as Joe mentioned, led by President Maida, both led by and inspired by, he has really pushed it into a larger conversation. Nancy Pelosi was at RISD last week to talk about it, and we're continuing to kind of get that out. And I think more and more people are starting to at least be familiar with the idea that art might be part of STEM learning, and it's not just tacking it into STEM, which at first I kind of thought of it as like, oh yeah, sure, because they have a bunch of money, so let's sneak art in there so that we can get a hold of some of that grant funding. But in fact, repositioning it so that people see art not just as a nice to have, but a must have. And understanding that art, when it's, particularly when it's framed within the STEM disciplines, is not necessarily fine art, but creativity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, both in my own practice, designing for others to design, or designing for children to have a relationship to learning and play and creativity that is exploratory, curious, and makes them both interested and interesting. And I'll talk about how as educators, we can kind of design to support that, or we can set up our classrooms to support that. So one of the first toys that I designed was called Gmo. And I designed this, it was my grad work at Cranbrook. I was very, very interested in multiple imaginations. So I was designing a lot of really playful objects that they weren't assigned a specific identity. And Gmo was picked up by a manufacturer, and it launched at the New York MoMA in 2007 and found its way into Montessori schools in Japan, as well as a lot of progressive educational schools throughout the world. And is still used in a number of curriculums. But what my goals with Gmo were specific to that the child or the person, while playing with it, is inventing the identity. And I'll pass them around. So, in a way, the what is it and the what do I do with it are discovered, explored, and imagined while it's being played with. And we've won some awards, and we found that one of the challenges with this, oops, so one of the challenges with an abstract toy or any kind of abstract form, wherein the identity is not assigned in terms of it's not SpongeBob, it's not a superhero, it's not a truck, it's not a giraffe, right? What is it? What do I do with this? It didn't translate into how do you sell this thing, and being that I'm kind of a terrible capitalist, I was trying really hard to not position it as a toy or as a building material, but ultimately I kind of gave in, and we started saying that the Gmo is to the body what building blocks are to architecture. So that in a way, that was a way of explaining how it might be interpreted or played with as a child movie. So it was played with in children's museums, and it continues to kind of push the boundaries of imagination and what is a learning material. And the next big project that I started on from there was with the Rockwell Group, which is a big architecture firm in New York City. And we had a number of collaborators and consultants from early education and public programming. We went through probably a year and a half of iterative making and testing. These are prototypes made out of foam and painstakingly taped. We decided that they needed to be sealed in case it rained while we were testing. So this is just insulated. You guys are probably mostly familiar with the insulation foam prototypes and models, but we had 3 or 4 different rounds of exploring form. So this started as I was hired to help David Rockwell reinvent the playground. And we literally started with the playground and said, why is it shaped like this? So, but in the process, we learned quite a bit about the importance of free play, the importance of loose parts. And as I did more research into how we learn and constructivist theory, I became very interested in building blocks. So we kind of came full circle from, you know, why does the playground look like this to what is a playground at all? So essentially in the end, the children make the playground. So this was one of our last testing kind of focus groups in Battery Park City. And this was the flagship site. It's in the South Seaport of Manhattan. And it literally is a different playground every day. And the children design the playground through playing with it. So there's this sand, part of the playground is sand, part of it is water, and then these blue blocks. The blue blocks that you see come out, and then they're put away at the end of the day. And there is some supervision. The New York City Parks Department made an agreement with Rockwell Group, and we did some sizable fundraising to ensure that we had 10 years of what we were calling a play, through a number of different names. So it was a play worker, I think, but the term work set a lot of people in a strange way, so I think we are calling it now play supporter, maybe. It's amazing what happens when things get published in the New York Times. But in the meantime, so my role in this were the blocks and a few, you know, little nuts and bolts here and there. But the site itself started to feel like such a pain in the butt, for lack of a better term. And as an industrial designer, you know, I'd already taken the playground and made it into little pieces that were easier to deal with. And so we saw a potential of just those blocks without the site itself. So from there we took it and it became a playground in a box. So this pop-up playground emerged. And these blocks are now used in a number of different, I think over 350 playgrounds worldwide now. And they're sold through the website imaginationplayground.org. And they are sold to schools as well as public parks. And then through another group, I did some illustrations and also some kind of conceptual proposals. This was actually, we proposed this through the Let's Move, Michelle Obama's Let's Move initiative. And our proposal was that on one of the lawns, South Lawn? One of the lawns of the White House was going to have essentially a bunch of cardboard boxes and found materials, basically junk. And children would come and paint and build giant things, and we would call it a pop-up adventure playground. So, and there would be hammers and nails, and essentially inspired by the European model of adventure playgrounds, where it's a bunch of parts and pieces with no instructions, and kids, of course, know exactly what to do. And they jump in and make whatever they want to. And they loved the idea, but they deemed it a little too messy for the White House just yet. So we're easing into it. But this is, we've done a few out and around New York. This one was on Governor's Island. And it's a big ugly mess every time, and the kids have a ball. And from there, at this point, actually, I was teaching at Syracuse University in their Industrial and Interaction Design department, and starting to explore more this idea of how do we help, rather than asking questions, how do we inspire our students to be the ones who are asking the questions? So I don't want to, as an educator, I don't want to teach this top-down kind of, I'm going to tell you something and you're going to absorb it. And then I started thinking, I really actually don't even want to ask them questions that they then answer. I want to somehow inspire them to be asking the questions, so that there's this more they have a much more proactive and curious approach to what they're learning, how they're learning, and it's a more intuitive understanding of why they're learning it. So because they're asking their own questions. So simultaneously with that kind of, what I was trying to do that in my classes, and the Friends of the Highline, which is the governing body of the Highland Park in Manhattan, asked me to design a playground for them. which immediately I was skeptical because it's a very narrow space. There's a lot of foot traffic, and so much foot traffic that actually and there's beautiful plantings and the landscaping is just gorgeous, but there's so much traffic that it's we have to stay on the paths, and it's kind of roped off in this subtle way so that you can't touch, because with thousands of people going by, if everybody touches the flower, if anybody steps on the grass, it's gone, right? So it was this interesting balance of simultaneously wanting kids to interact with the nature, but knowing that they really couldn't. So we went back and forth about how can we, that there would be some kid-proof lawn that we put slope that they can roll down, but between the traffic and you actually can't touch the plantings because it's too much touching. I tried to design something that would turn their attention to the industrial nature of the Highland. Now the Highland is an elevated railroad that used to convey primarily food from the meat packing district of Manhattan to where the shipyards came in. And it had laid abandoned for 50 years, but it's still a railroad, and there are some really beautiful old big bolts, and it had some really nice details. And so I designed the Highland Children's Workyard Care. This was one of my original proposals, that it be essentially a pile of planks and lumber and big bolts and pulleys and things that kids could build. And so in the nature of pop-up, because it also needed to be mobile, so that now the Highland runs from 12th to 30th Street, and it's about to go even further. When Section 3 opens, they're opening it little at a time. So this can be a playground wherever they happen to have space, or wherever they decide to have space, or decide that they need it at that point. So it pops open and then makes a big mess, which makes me really happy. And in this, again, I try to design the instructions into the parts and pieces in a way that they're intuitive enough that that kids, again, they see it and they know what to do with it. So, where as an adult, because we tend to, unfortunately, kind of be encumbered by what if I do this wrong, or ooh, I need to learn how to use it first. Or, we should usually read instructions, so we're used to wanting to read instructions. But kids just dive in, they know exactly what to do with this. And it's different every time. So for me, that's successful. So essentially, it's a series of planks, so from 2 to 6 holes. So the longest plank is actually really large. And what was important to me is that, can you guys hear me okay out here? Yeah. In designing playgrounds in Manhattan, of course, we wish that we could give them some nature to interact with, because I'm thinking about what do children who live, or families who live in very densely urban spaces, what do they need? And one of the things that I was struck by in talking to families and kids is that they actually can't rearrange their living rooms and make forts in their houses very often, because it's too small. If you move the table, then all of a sudden it's in the kitchen. So I found that kids needed to be able to really affect their space. And I've since learned the importance of spatial thinking through building something that's larger than them. But in the case of both of the playgrounds that I was working on, I think it's very empowering to have something that's larger than you. So it was important to me that the pieces were large, which was a tricky sell, because of course the bigger something is, the heavier it is, and then the more dangerous it's perceived to be. So in the background, of course, there are all of these conversations about risk, and as playgrounds are getting more and more padded, there's a movement, and in case you didn't know, you'll be happy to know, I hope you'd be happy to know, there's a movement toward people realizing the importance of risk within play, but that's kind of a different story. So in the meantime, there's some small, I'll pass these around too. I like twigs. And I'm now, so this was a project that I had one batch made, and then I've since redesigned it. So the parts you have there are kind of samples. They don't actually have a finish on them. I have to grab what I had. But the bolts, they call them wing bolts, those are injection molded in upstate New York out of recycled nylon. And this is where the industrial designer comes out. I could go off on all of the really cool details of that. But the important part is that it reduced the cost by about 600% to re-engineer it for mass production. So these are now being sold to schools at about $2,000 a kit. So there's a large classroom set and a smaller classroom set. So, and back to the how do we tap into that STEM has money and art doesn't? Well, of course, back to we're trying to get art into the STEM. But for me, and Joe likes that at some point I said sneaky about this, because this can be sold as a STEM learning. Obviously, I definitely have the science, technology, engineering, and math advantages for grade school kids. But what's important is that they're designing it. It doesn't have instructions. This is a crane. And it was fairly elaborate, actually. So I don't know if you can tell, but there's a pulley up top, and it had 2 stages of lifting this bucket that these 2 boys made. And of course, it was mobile. You'll see, the tires, the wheels. So simple machines, and then the abstract ones. When I asked these 2, this is a brother and sister, they were playing together for probably an hour and a half, and occasionally instructing mom and dad to go get certain parts or go borrow from that kid who's got the big one, So at the end I said, okay, so tell me about this, because you don't want to say, what did you make? Because then that implies that they have to make something. And if you say, what did you build? Then it implies that it's got to be something that's built, so instantly it needs to be a building. Oh my God, I was supposed to build something. So I came up to these 2 and I said, tell me about this. And she says that, it's an elephant, and it has wings, and the fairy told me the story about how it got wings. And he's looking at her like she's completely insane. And he said, this is a spaceship with a water slide. And they've been playing together for an hour and a half in cooperating and collaborating so beautifully and building completely different things. But they both somehow knew, like, no, that one has to go there. Yeah, that goes there. We need a bracket to put that one there. So that also just like, that's where designers like, oh, yes, it worked. And then just contraptions and the other element that makes that I like to see as often as possible are the children who build nothing. They're just building for the sake of building. So the act of and the process of playing and the process of making something is the goal. It's not about what it's going to be, and it's not about that it's going to be right, or it's going to pull the thing, or support the whatever, or look like, or be the tallest. They're just completely engrossed in the building. Just a few more things. So in the process of bringing it, I mentioned that these were all pictures of it on the High Line, where it's used every, I think it comes out around May, and they have to put it away somewhere in October when it starts to get too cold. But, and so it continues to have a life there. But in the process of trying to find a kind of market for it and re-engineering it for mass production and thinking about how it fits into a classroom, a lot of the teachers that I talked to, well, they had a vision for how they would use it in their classrooms. They recognized that a lot of teachers may not, or that even if they were an enormously creative teacher, it's just not what they're going to want to do is sit down and think of a curriculum. So we've been trying to develop a curriculum with some really simple prompts that aren't, here's an image of the thing to build, but things like, so some of the questions here are, what is the tallest freestanding structure? You can make the 15 pieces. Build a rigamajig, you can get inside it. So in relaunching it, it will now be called the rigamajig. So this is a funny moment where it's both the workyard kit and the rigamajig, because I'm about to shift everything over next month. So this is a draft of a future challenges. So some of the prompts for the K through 6-ish grade students who are using it. How many different ways can you join 3 pieces? Build a contraption that allows you to send a bucket from one place to another. Can you build a rigamajig you can sit on? Build a contraption that will take you to the center of the earth. So there are a number of there are a variety of things that are both abstract and somewhat contraptionist. So like back to the engineering, and as open-ended as what can you build with 20 pieces, and then as kind of fantastical as build something to take you to the moon. So these are photos from some of the classrooms, and again, I loved this, that the wheel on the bottom, I never would have thought of that. Every time that I go to observe, which I love doing, I sit like a little fly in the corner and take notes. I see things I never would have thought of, or couldn't have even imagined designing for. So, this is the big image in new direction. And Risky steam to steam. So essentially, in closing, for me, the importance and there's a number of different ways to come at why art belongs into the STEM, or how and why as educators we can integrate creative thinking into the STEM discipline or into any disciplines. And for me, it's important that we remember that art isn't fine art necessarily, but art is about creative thinking and approach and process. And specifically, the testing, the playing, the revising, the conceptualizing, the imagining, and the sketching, whether it be on paper or in life, that we kind of sketch some things and look at it and then re-sketch it so that they're a little bit less precious. But those are all things that are part of an art process and part of a design process that can be brought into the science, technology, engineering, and math. Like imagine if every engineer had taken a sketching class or could build things, and they actually had a hands-on experience of how things work. Or what would happen with mathematics? Like if we look at Galileo and all of their charts and figures, they know how to draw. So just back to that for me, design and play and learning is about much more than what we know as traditional graphic design, industrial design, website design, etc. But it's about curiosity, observation, tinkering, exploring, being willing to try, and I think in a large part, having an interest in contributing. So the moments that the collaboration and the cooperation comes into some of the play and a lot of the design and art process, it's about contributing and doing and wanting to put something out there and being willing to have it be seen and maybe not liked. But for the most part, it would have been successful for the child or designer or artist that was part of the process. Thank you. Questions?
I was wondering if there was a specific reason why the Rigmajig pieces were made out of wood and not the same plastic material that the bolts are made out of.
Yeah, for me, particularly with toys, there are very few toys, and children they don't have a lot of opportunities to interact with real materials. And I find that, and you may remember this from childhood, how many people wanted to play with it? If you had a toy hammer and a real hammer, which one did you want to play with, right? You wanted the real hammer. Well, I didn't pose that as a question. How many people wanted to play with it? I already did that. I do this in class all the time. But I find that they're attracted to real things. And they can handle real things. Children can hammer hammers and nails, and they can take a large piece, and there's a perception of risk. When they have something heavy, they know that it's more dangerous. So if you hand a child a pool noodle and a baseball bat, the pool noodle they're going to take and whack everybody that they know, because that's really fun. The baseball bat, they're not going to do that, because they know that it's a heavy thing and that there's a perceived risk. In the same way that with these blue blocks, they're actually a pretty dense, it's an EVA foam, which is antimicrobial and it's easy to clean and relatively inexpensive. But they're heavy, they're large, and they're dense, they're hard, and it would hurt if that fell down. And when I watch children play in these things, they're careful in a way, and they also, they'll have the urge to knock something over, but they'll peek around the corner first and make sure nobody's there, and then knock it over. So it's different than how they play with the big cardboard blocks or things that are really light and seem like marshmallows and they can get hurt. So anyway, so that back to wood for me is important, because it's a real material, and it'll last. It's an heirloom toy. And B, I think that the weight and the heft is important.